As you'd probably expect from a series about pirates, the One Piece world consists of countless islands, but is otherwise almost completely covered by an ocean known as the Blue Sea. How much geography can you really talk about in a world with just a single continent? Well, quite a bit by the looks of things. But that's right, you heard me correctly. As far as we know, there is only a single continent in the entire One Piece world. But it is a very large continent wrapping around the entire planet, dividing it in half, leaving it with a very apt name, the Red Line. And let's make it a good pirate story by marking the map with a couple of X's, by making another ring around the planet perpendicular to the first one. However, like our world, you can get to any part of the ocean by boat. Kind of. Most people say that there are 4 to 6 oceans or seas, but there are arguably 10. I am no geographist. Are there any other academic fields with a title for experts that don't end in ist? Why is it geographer and not geographist? I feel like it should be geographist. So I did a quick Google search on the difference between ocean and sea, and most of the results seem to be pretty arbitrary, so don't get mad at me as I arbitrarily flip between the two. Given what we've talked about so far, it's clear to see how you could define 4 oceans, and those 4 are known as the 4 blues: North Blue, South Blue, East Blue, and West Blue. The story starts in the East Blue, but the vast majority of the story does not take place in any of the 4 blues. It takes place in that other ring, dividing the world, another ocean, or pair of oceans considering the Red Line splits it in half, known as the Grand Line. You may be wondering how an ocean could divide the world. Well, the Grand Line doesn't. That's what the other 4 oceans are for. Each of these oceans shares a name that provides a hint about how they divide the world of One Piece, making it very difficult to get into or out of the Grand Line for normal individuals. The oceans separating the 4 blues from the Grand Line are collectively known as the Calm Belt. As the name suggests, the waters in these oceans are unnaturally calm. There is no wind, seemingly no waves, and presumably no sea currents. Almost all ships in the One Piece world are sailing vessels, so this on its own poses a problem. But surely you could just row or paddle your way through, right? Sure, but not safely. You see, these waters also just so happen to be the preferred nesting site for the giant sea monsters known as Sea Kings. And like many other creatures, they are protective of their nests. This may surprise you, but there are not many people living in the Calm Belt. Imagine that. Most people in the One Piece world live in the 4 blues. You just have your regular civilians going about their normal lives in each of these, and the climate is probably very much like you would expect. We actually only fairly recently got the official canon orientation of this map, and it hasn't even been revealed in the anime yet. Most maps, including those from official sources, would either leave the compass rose off the map entirely, or make the Grand Line the equator. It turns out, though, that the North Pole is actually in the North Blue, with the equator presumably bisecting the East and West Blues. Like our world, the North and South Poles are cold, with the general climate of the 4 blues getting warmer towards the equator. However, the isolation of these oceans gives each a bit of cultural identity. So what kind of patterns do we tend to see from each? Many of the characters coming from the North Blue are royalty or have some tie to wealth. Those on top of the world live on top of the world. You may follow that same thread to think that the underbelly of society may reside in the South Blue, but unfortunately, the South is instead the sea known for technology. And Karate Island. If you feel the need to find symbolic justification for this, you could say that it symbolizes the world government's suppression of its people. The criminal organizations are instead where the sun sets, in the West, where the entire sea is controlled by 5 mafia families known as the 5 Families of the West. It's a real creative name, but it took a while to think that up. Probably based on the real 5 families. Now looking towards the rising sun, you'll find the East Blue, where the story begins on Luffy's home island, Dawn Island. Despite being home to the Pirate King and even the leader of the revolutionaries, the East Blue is seen as the weakest sea. Some see that as negative, but others see it as a sign of peace. Now let's follow Luffy on to the Grand Line. You might be thinking that the 4 blues being so like our world is boring, but the Grand Line is full of danger and wonder. Mostly, if not all, thanks to the mysterious nature of the islands. Curiously, most if not all islands have their own strong magnetic fields, making compasses completely useless, instead requiring devices known as log poses to navigate. Although navigation is beyond the scope of this video, and I'll be covering that in a future video. Another interesting feature is the climate surrounding these islands. Some have seasons just like ours. Others have more extreme or different number of seasons, and others perpetually exist in a single season, completely independent to their geographic location. And the nearly complete isolation of some result in specialized evolution, or the island being practically frozen in time. These bizarre and extreme localized climates then bring about extreme weather phenomena between islands. The weather could go from clear and sunny to a blizzard to waterspouts or cyclones in a matter of seconds. Despite all of this, the first half of the Grand Line is often called paradise because compared to the second half, the New World, it really is paradise. Part of that is the result of the strong gathering in the New World in search of the One Piece. But the climate does get even more extreme in the second half of the Grand Line. We still really don't know what was going on with islands like Raijin Island, but many of us think that it's the result of a Devil Fruit Awakening, which will be getting its own video. Despite all of this danger in the Grand Line, there are still plenty of normal civilians living relatively peacefully on the various islands across the Grand Line. The stability of the climate on many islands makes it relatively safe to live, and the pirates being pirates don't make landfall too often. Although most places without a sufficient standing army or otherwise powerful residents do tend to seek the protection from one of the world's powers in one way or another, and I'll be covering those other powers in probably a few videos actually. For the most part, the Grand Line itself only poses a major risk to civilians if they try to leave their islands without a competent escort. I did mention before that you could get anywhere on the Blue Sea by boat, but how could you possibly get across a continent by boat? Is there a massive canal through the Red Line? Well, no. In fact, you're probably thinking that the Red Line is something very different than it is. It's really just a continent by technicality, and it's climatically, there's no red squiggle on that, so I'm just gonna go with it, like it consists of countless Grand Line islands strung together, each with its own climatic zone. It would probably be better to think of it as an enormous red rock wall, sheer cliffs towering 10 kilometers over the sea. So how could anyone get to the Grand Line? Well, the answer to that is Reverse Mountain. At the intersection of the Grand Line and the Red Line, there's a steep mountain with a waterfall that flows into the first half of the Grand Line. Now, how is this waterfall fed? Well, you may be able to tell if you look closely, but there are currents from the Four Blues. Yes, there are ocean currents that flow towards the Red Line and up a channel to the peak where the four currents meet before flowing down into paradise. You might be thinking that there must be a similar phenomenon at the other intersection between the Grand and Red Lines in order to get from Paradise to the New World. Nope! On top of that part of the Red Line is where you'll find the Holy Land Marijois, or Marijois, or I don't know. I feel like it's Marijois, but I've heard several pronunciations. Where the Celestial Dragons, also known as the World Nobles, live. Sitting atop the world both figuratively and literally, far above even those in the North Blue. While there is a gondola that leads up to the top of the Red Line and back down the other side for use by the Celestial Dragons, their servants, and even tourists, as well as Marines and realistically anyone who can pay, and who isn't wanted by the world government, it of course isn't an option for pirates. So, if you can't go over it, can't go around it, gotta go under it. Yes, there is a tunnel through the Red Line, 10,000 meters below the surface. Oda really seems to like that number. On either side of the Grand Line, you'll find the Yurikimon mangrove, which produces a resin that forms bubbles with many very interesting properties. The only property we really need to worry about now, though, is that you can coat a ship with this resin to encapsulate it in a bubble that allows the ship to dive and ride the ocean currents to navigate down to Fishman Island in the tunnel at the bottom of the Red Line. You might be thinking that it would be dark down there in Fishman Island, but no. The heart of this mangrove is known as the Sunlight Tree Eve, carrying light from the surface all the way down like an enormous fiber optic cable. So if you have Reverse Mountain to go into the Grand Line, and you have Fishman Island to go under the Red Line, or the gondola to go over to get to the New World, how do you get out of the Grand Line? To be completely honest, we don't actually know at this point, but presumably by the time you get to the end, you're probably strong enough to defend yourself on the way out over the Calm Belt. Meanwhile, for Marines, it's really largely a non-issue at this point because they have developed technology whereby coating the underside of their ships with kairoseki, they are all but invisible to the Sea Kings. They don't sense them, see them as a threat, and they can just pass through the Calm Belt either way. With that, you know the basics of the Blue Sea, so that must be everything. The fact that most of the planet is relatively normal, while the Red Line, Calm Belt, and islands of the Grand Line are truly bizarre, lead many to believe that they are actually artificial. After all, dividing the world is very helpful to those ruling it. The mysterious gates leading to and up the currents of Reverse Mountain are also suspicious, and the magnetic fields of all of these islands on the surface, with a single undersea one, as far as we know, that not only allows passage through the red line, while also being conveniently located exactly where the trees that make it possible to make it down there seems a little too convenient. And while we don't know how they may have erected something like the Red Line or created the Calm Belt, I'm guessing devil fruit powers were involved, we have seen a man-made wall that makes Wall Maria from Attack on Titan look like a playset. There is also quite a bit of other evidence to support this hypothesis, and I touch a bit more on that in my video on the One Piece. Anyways, I probably won't be doing more geography videos anytime soon, if ever. If you want to know more about One Piece geography, the playlist I flashed up at the beginning was the Geography is Everything series by Tekking101. He is kind of entertaining. Go give him a watch if you're not familiar. Speaking of that series, I was complimented on this shirt by some old guy in a hotel a few years back saying something like, "It's nice to see the youth expressing interest in geography." I was just thinking, sir, I'm in my mid-20s and I don't know much about actual geography. This shirt's about an anime. I'm just a regular old weeb.